O Partha, how can a person who knows that the soul is indestructible, unborn, eternal, and immutable kill anyone or cause anyone to kill? Vasamshi jirnani yata vihaya navani grinati naro parani tata sharirani vihaya girnani anyani samyati navani dehi. As a person puts on new garments, giving up old ones, similarly the soul accepts new material bodies, giving up the old and useless ones. Nainam chindanti shastrani, nainam dahati pavaka, na chainam kledayantiapo, na shoshayati maruta. The soul can never be cut into pieces by any weapon, nor can he be burned by fire, nor moistened by water, nor withered by the wind. Back to text 12. Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be. In the Vedas, in the Katha Upanishad, as well as in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, it is said that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the maintainer of innumerable living entities, in terms of their different situations according to individual work and reaction of work. That Supreme Personality of Godhead is also, by his plenary portions, alive in the heart of every living entity. Only saintly persons who can see within and without the same Supreme Lord can actually attain to perfect and eternal peace. Nityo nityanam chetanas chetananam eko bahunam yo vidadati kaman tam atmastam ye nupashyanti diras tesham shanti shashvati nitaresham. The same Vedic truth given to Arjuna is given to all persons in the world who pose themselves as very learned, but factually have but a poor fund of knowledge. The Lord says clearly that he himself, Arjuna, and all the kings who are assembled on the battlefield are eternally individual beings, and that the Lord is eternally the maintainer of the individual living entities, both in their conditioned as well as in their liberated situations. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is the supreme individual person, and Arjuna, the Lord's eternal associate, and all the kings assembled there are individual, eternal persons. It is not that they did not exist as individuals in the past, and it is not that they will not remain eternal persons. Their individuality existed in the past, and their individuality will continue in the future without interruption. Therefore, there is no cause for lamentation for anyone. The Mayavadi theory that after liberation, the individual soul, separated by the covering of Maya or illusion, will merge into the impersonal Brahman and lose its individual existence is not supported herein by Lord Krishna, the supreme authority. Nor is the theory that we only think of individuality in the conditioned state supported herein. Krishna clearly says herein that in the future also the individuality of the Lord and others, as it is confirmed in the Upanishads, will continue eternally. This statement of Krishna is authoritative because Krishna cannot be subject to illusion. If individuality is not a fact, then Krishna would not have stressed it so much, even for the future. The Mayavadi may argue that the individuality spoken of by Krishna is not spiritual, but material. Even accepting the argument that the individuality is material, then how can one distinguish Krishna's individuality? Krishna affirms his individuality in the past and confirms his individuality in the future also. He has confirmed his individuality in many ways, and impersonal Brahman has been declared to be subordinate to him. Krishna has maintained spiritual individuality all along. If he is accepted as an ordinary conditioned soul in individual consciousness, then his Bhagavad-gita has no value as authoritative scripture. A common man with all the 4 defects of human frailty is unable to teach that which is worth hearing. The Gita is above such literature. No mundane book compares with the Bhagavad-gita. When one accepts Krishna as an ordinary man, the Gita loses all importance. The Mayavadi argues that the plurality mentioned in this verse is conventional and that it refers to the body. But previous to this verse, such a bodily conception is already condemned. After condemning the bodily conception of the living entities, how was it possible for Krishna to place a conventional proposition on the body again? Therefore, individuality is maintained on spiritual grounds and is thus confirmed by great acharyas. like Sri Ramanuja and others. It is clearly mentioned in many places in the Gita that this spiritual individuality is understood by those who are devotees of the Lord. Those who are envious of Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead have no bona fide access to the great literature. The non-devotee's approach to the teachings of the Gita is something like bees licking on a bottle of honey. One cannot have a taste of honey unless one opens the bottle. Similarly, the mysticism of the Bhagavad-gita can be understood only by devotees, and no one else can taste it, as it is stated in the 4th chapter of the book. Nor can the Gita be touched by persons who envy the very existence of the Lord. Therefore, the Mayavadi explanation of the Gita is a most misleading presentation of the whole truth. Lord Chaitanya has forbidden us to read commentations made by the Mayavadis and warns that one who takes to such an understanding of the Mayavadi philosophy loses all power to understand the real mystery of the Gita. If individuality refers to the empirical universe, then there is no need of teaching by the Lord. The plurality of the individual soul and of the Lord is an eternal fact, and it is confirmed by the Vedas as above mentioned. Maharaj, would you like to speak anything on this verse?
Yes. This point about the impersonalists say that the plurality described in this verse is only referring to the body. But after, here, Prabhupada says in the purport, but previous to this verse, such a bodily conception is already condemned. Never was there a time when I didn't exist. So before that, the material conception has been, I'm confused about my duty, I've lost all composure.
Magadari was saying, is it number 11? Text 11?
Well, let's see, number 11 says, this is, Lord said, while speaking the words, you are mourning for what is not worthy of grief. Yes, those who are wise lament neither for the living nor the dead. Lord at once took the position of the teacher, chastised the student. Lord said, you are talking like a learned man, but you do not know that one who's learned, one who knows that what is the body and what is the soul, does not lament for any stage of the body. Yes. So he understands the soul and the body as being different things. And he doesn't lament because there's no death of the soul. So that means that Krishna is speaking about souls, not the bodies. He's saying that you, I, and all these kings are individuals, past, present, and future. So that can't be taken as bodies, because he's already explained that. And he's not going to go back now and say we are the body.
Thank you. So when we were reading through the purport, one thing I was thinking of was where this whole Mayavadi philosophy is coming from. And so we also get a nice outline of that in the Vedic literature, like the Bhagavad-gita and the Bhagavatam. So one of the incarnations of the Lord was his incarnation as Lord Buddha, who came to save the world from misusing the Vedic injunctions for the purpose of sense gratification, for eating animals. So since these Vedic injunctions for animal sacrifice were being misused, Lord Buddha came and said, don't worry about the Vedic scriptures. Actually, there's no such thing as God. Just worship me. But he was God. So in this way, it was actually helpful for those people who were living in a degraded way, misusing the sacrifices mentioned in the Vedas. So he took everyone away from the Vedas, and this is all the plan of the Lord. And then similarly, by the plan of the Lord, Shankaracharya appears later on to bring people back to the Vedic literature, but to also cover the Vedic literature, the real meaning of it over. So this Mayavadi philosophy is coming from Shankaracharya, who brings people back to the Vedas by presenting it in this whole convoluted way, where the essence of it is telling the living entities that they are God. And this is what makes it such a detrimental stumbling block to anyone's life, because the whole purpose of life is to understand who we are and our relationship to the Supreme Personality of Godhead and engage in his devotional service. So once the living entity is taught that you are that Supreme Person, then the whole thing is messed up, because then there's no question of service. The whole idea is confused. So this Mayavadi philosophy, that's why it says Lord Chaitanya forbids the hearing of commentaries made by Mayavadis, because it's so confusing and so much backward to the goal of life that there's nothing helpful from hearing it. One will actually become degraded by hearing it, because they're thinking they are the Supreme. And from there, you can't actually, and no service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, can actually come out of that. And the whole philosophy is pretty bogus. It doesn't really make much sense just from the beginning. Shri Shri Gaurnitai Ki Jai. For a conditioned living being to think that they're equal with the Supreme Lord doesn't make much sense, because we're conditioned in so many ways. I remember hearing this one lecture where Radhanath Swami was explaining how he gave a class at a college, and one of the students, he stood up in the class and he said, "I am God." And Radhanath Swami said, "Please accept my humble obeisances." And he said, "I accept." And after the class, he stuck around and they were speaking to each other. And so one of the devotees went and they locked a bathroom from the inside so no one could get into it. And this person who was thinking he was God was having this discussion. Then he said, "Okay, I'll be right back. I just have to use the bathroom." And he went to the bathroom and started knocking on the door, saying he wasn't able to get in. Someone was in there. And then he was saying, "Hurry up, I have to use the restroom." And Radhanath Swami was telling him that he could go inside if he just admits that he wasn't God. And then he's like, no, I'm God. It's okay. Just let me in. I'll explain more how I'm God afterwards. And he's like, no, just admit you're God. And so after this whole thing went on, he said, "Okay, I'm not God." And they let him into the bathroom. But one of the main points that was said, Radhanath Swami said, "If you're God, then control your bowels." So I thought that was a really nice point. People can't even control the functions of this one body that we're inhabiting. So how could we think that we're controlling the whole universe? It doesn't make any sense. And Lord Chaitanya, he met Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, who was teaching him about he said that he would teach Lord Chaitanya the Vedas, because it's the duty of a sannyasi to hear Vedanta and things like this. So out of duty, and because he ordered Lord Chaitanya agreed to hear from him. And so for 7 days he was speaking Vedanta, but it was this whole covered over Mayavadi interpretation of it. And at the end of speaking, he asked Lord Chaitanya, "I've been speaking for 7 days and you haven't said anything. Are you understanding it? Are you not understanding what is going on?" And Lord Chaitanya explained that I can understand the meaning of each of the verses clearly, but the interpretation, the purport that you're giving to them is completely covering them over and confusing me. And then for the rest of that chapter, Lord Chaitanya smashes the Mayavadi philosophy and establishes the real truth that the living entities are always subordinate to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. And he goes into detail about Krishna's different energies. There's the superior energy, the living entities, the separated energy, the material energy. And the marginal energy, the living entities, because they can be in the material world or the spiritual world. We were at one college when there was a professor, and he actually had a whole class pretty much teaching Mayavadi philosophy. There was this Indian professor, and he was teaching his class outside behind the book table. And I asked him what he was teaching, and he said, I'm teaching the purpose of life or something like that. And the rest of the day, I could hear some snippets, and he was quoting shlokas, but it was essentially teaching everyone that, they are God, they can do whatever they like in the world, and it'll turn out perfect. That they're all one, these kind of ideas. And at the end of that day when we were leaving, the teacher came up to us to ask about what we were doing and everything. And when he started presenting this whole Mayavadi idea, and this is something I've heard from a lot of devotees, how this philosophy doesn't hold up in any way when you put it into practical reality. So he began explaining how we're all one, and now I'm you and you're me, and we're going to merge into the Brahman at the end of it all. And so I told him that if we're all one, then if we're the same person, I'd like to have my money back that's in my wallet, that's in your pants, in your pocket. And so he tried to explain some other things, saying, there is no wallet, it's just a figment of your imagination or something like that. I said, well, then can I just have my watch? Because he had this Apple Watch on. And so anyway, the philosophy, it doesn't make any sense, because they're saying I'm you and you're me, but then when you actually put it into practical terms, the whole thing breaks down. Because he gave me the watch, but then he's saying, I want my watch back. So then I was saying, well, then we must be individual people if it's your watch. And he was saying, okay, yeah, that is something I have to think about. And the next day at the same school, this guy came up who was saying that he was studying Buddhism and practicing Buddhism or something. And then he had said, as far as I understand, we are nothing. So this makes even less sense. It's just to hear it is really strange. But Prabhupada defeats all these hodgepodge philosophies really nicely in his purports. So if we just remember the things that he says, then we might be able to help some people and convince them that this idea they have isn't correct, and then they might be interested in reading Prabhupada's books. So I just remembered what Prabhupada had said in a purport or in a lecture somewhere, where he just pretty much defeats this philosophy by just asking them to explain it, pretty much, because it doesn't make any sense. So he is saying that we are nothing, and I just asked him, who is the we that's supposedly nothing? He said, oh, well, we just imagine that and I said, so who's the we that's imagining? He says, well, you just think you're an individual. And I said, so who's the you that's thinking? He said, well, you just make the idea. I said, who's the you that's making the idea? So I just asked him like that, and then he became stumped, and we talked a little bit more, and then he bought the Srimad Bhagavatam, because he realized the idea that he had didn't really hold up. So Prabhupada shows how these philosophies don't make sense, and he gives a really clear arguments against them throughout all of the purports. Is there anything else on this particular text and purport. Yes, Maternath Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. So one might read text 11 and 12 and think, those Hare Krishnas, they have very hard hearts. Their Lord is telling them not to lament for family members who have passed away or, like that. But yet, or they could pose the argument that, what about Srila Prabhupada? When he left his body, all the devotees were in a state of lamentation. So could you describe spiritual lamentation versus material lamentation? And, what's appropriate?
The spiritual, material lamentation is because they think that the person that they were fond of is no longer existing. And that's a terrible thought. That's a haunting thought that they don't exist anymore. And but the person who's in knowledge knows that they do exist. They're just in a different body. They're somewhere else. So it takes all the illusion out of it, mistaken. And if the proof is that where is the person that you say passed away, where did you ever see him? Did you ever? So they never saw the person that they say has passed away, but they say he's not there in the body that they're lamenting after. So it's bewildering. But the lamenting over the departure of passing away of a saintly person it's also bittersweet, because the remembering that person and his greatness and his association, that's transcendental and that's blissful. Even sometimes it's separation, or feelings in separation are considered more relishable than in meeting on the spiritual platform. So that's not understandable to the materialists, because they don't understand the soul. And how could the soul exist and have feelings? And so therefore they feel vacant when they lose a loved one, because they don't know that the loved one is still living. So if you tell them, explain that to them, that your beloved father, mother, whatever friend, he's not dead, he's still living. He has another body now.
Are there any other comments or questions on this?
Just in case you have a academic audience, material academia, H.D. Goswami, who taught, religious studies and studied it at Harvard, states that Buddha never claimed that there was no God, but his followers asked him about, do you believe in the God or the soul? And he would not respond. And then his followers created the concept that Buddha says there is no God or soul. Just to throw that out there, according to H.D. Goswami's study, you can actually read Buddha's lecture, and it doesn't state that, according to H.D. Goswami, it doesn't state that Buddha stated that. So just in case you have an academic, just to give yourself some little more credence in their minds, I want to consider that.
Thank you. One other, oh yeah. You can go ahead. A question online? That sounds good.
No, just
Oh, yeah.
so on this topic of hearing, so Lord Chaitanya says we shouldn't hear from the Mayavadi, and then Prabhupada puts in the purport that if we accept such a philosophy, then we can't understand Gita. So I'm just wondering about if there's a difference between hearing and accepting the philosophy, and how much does a preacher need to tolerate from a potential candidate of devotional service, speaking their own philosophy?
Well, I know we don't want to hear the Mayavad philosophy at all because it is contaminating. I remember just recently someone was asking Maharaj in class, when we're on book distribution, Bhakti was asking this, how can we not become contaminated by hearing from people when we're out on Sankirtan? And Maharaj gave a very concise answer explaining how they take our books, we don't take their books. So I thought that was a very helpful and concise way of understanding it. We're not there to take up their philosophy or buy some of their books or something, but they might speak for some time and then we give them the proper understanding of what it was. Like I remember Ananda Prabhu was always very expert at this. Someone might present some philosophy or some idea, and then he would show how whatever they were saying is actually what the reality of it is, like how it was right in terms of Bhagavad-gita. Like maybe they say it's all one. Then he would say, well, yeah, and one, he would say, yeah, that's there, and then explain how, and Krishna has his effulgence, everything is emanating from him, who is the eternal one, supreme living being. So we don't want to hear the Mayavad philosophy, but if we're preaching to someone and giving our association, then we may be able to help them. As far as how long to hear from them when you're speaking to them, I'm not sure exactly. We wouldn't want to hear it very much. And another point on this whole Mayavad philosophy is that it's just stemming from the root cause of the living beings being in the material world, which is this enviousness of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. So when the living being doesn't want to be who they naturally are, which is an eternal servant of Krishna, then we get the chance to be here in this material world and act on material desires. So this Mayavad philosophy is just another layer of that, where the living entities can think, okay, I am the Supreme. That's like about as envious as it gets, saying that not only do I not believe in this person or this or that, but they're saying I am that person. So it's just another layer of this envy.
One thing you might want to consider, though, is Prabhupada states that mentality is the last snare of Maya. So that person's on the last snare. So almost there. So we could take advantage of that person's. Maharaj was going into this yesterday in class, in Srimad Bhagavatam class, expertly, as always. And definitely be careful, but at the same time, a grand opportunity.
That's a good point with preaching to them or hearing if someone starts presenting this. It's actually a good opportunity with preaching to them because they're on the last snare of Maya. So it's like by the Lord's plan, Shankaracharya has just lined up he pitched the ball to you. Now you can just hit it on back to Godhead. So we can go to the next verse. Dehi noshmin yata dehe kamarom yovanam jara tata dehantara praptir dirastatra namuyati. As the embodied soul continually passes in this body from boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. The self-realized soul is not bewildered by such a change. Purport. Since every living entity is an individual soul, each is changing his body every moment, manifesting sometimes as a child, sometimes as a youth, and sometimes as an old man. Yet the same spirit soul is there and does not undergo any change. This individual soul finally changes the body at death and transmigrates to another body. And since it is sure to have another body in the next birth, either material or spiritual, there is no cause for lamentation by Arjuna on account of death, neither for Bhishma nor for Drona, for whom he was so much concerned. Rather, he should rejoice for their changing bodies from old to new ones, thereby rejuvenating their energy. Such changes of body account for varieties of enjoyment or suffering according to one's work in life. So Bhishma and Drona, being noble souls, were surely going to have either spiritual bodies in the next life, or at least life in heavenly bodies for superior enjoyment of material existence. So in either case there is no cause of lamentation. Any man who has perfect knowledge of the constitution of the individual soul, the super soul and nature, both material and spiritual, is called a dhira, or a most sober man. Such a man is never deluded by the change of bodies. The Mayavadi theory of oneness of the spirit soul cannot be entertained on the ground that spirit soul cannot be cut into pieces as a fragmental portion. Such cutting into different individual souls would make the supreme cleavable or changeable against the principle of the supreme soul being unchangeable. As confirmed in the Gita, the fragmental portions of the supreme exist eternally, sanatana, and are called kshara. That is, they have a tendency to fall down into material nature. These fragmental portions are eternally so, and even after liberation, the individual soul remains the same, fragmental. But once liberated, he lives an eternal life in bliss and knowledge with the personality of Godhead. The theory of reflection can be applied to the supersoul who is present in each and every individual body and is known as the Paramatma, who is different from the individual living entity. When the sky is reflected in water, the reflections represent both the sun and the moon and the stars also. The stars can be compared to the living entities, and the sun or the moon to the Supreme Lord. The individual fragmental spirit soul is represented by Arjuna, and the Supreme Soul is the personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. They are not on the same level, as it will be apparent in the beginning of the 4th chapter. If Arjuna is on the same level with Krishna, and Krishna is not superior to Arjuna, then the relationship of instructor and instructed becomes meaningless. If both of them are deluded by the illusory energy, Maya, then there is no need of one being the instructor and the other the instructed. Such instruction would be useless, because in the clutches of Maya, no one can be an authoritative instructor. Under the circumstances, it is admitted that Lord Krishna is the Supreme Lord, superior in position to the living entity, Arjuna, who is a forgotten soul deluded by Maya. So it's really helpful that we're seeing throughout the paragraph, Srila Prabhupada is again giving us this proper understanding how the living entity is always subordinate to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. There's an analogy where Krishna is like the gold mine, where all of the gold is, and the living entity is like a tiny earring or something made from that gold. So it has the same quality, the same chemicals and materials are there in that piece of jewelry, but all of that is even more in unlimited quantity in the mine. It's the same quality, but different quantity. And this is really helpful to understand because being in the material world and in a conditioned state of existence, the living entity is forgetful of the position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So we want to remember actually Krishna's position properly. He says in the Bhagavad-gita that one who understands his appearance and is one who properly understands him, that person goes back to him at the end of this life. So we want to properly understand Krishna. So it's good to hear very concisely what our position is and Krishna's position as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and us being very tiny, minute part and parcels of him, it's very helpful to hear this often. Like we hear that Krishna, he's the supreme enjoyer, the supreme proprietor, and the supreme friend. But in a conditioned state, I might subtly begin to think that somehow or other I have those qualities, and then the whole thing becomes a mess because I'm trying to engage in Krishna's service. So then if I'm thinking I am any of those things, it doesn't work. But subtly that can start to come up where I'm thinking, okay, I can enjoy like this or like that. But that's actually not true because Krishna is the enjoyer. So it's like a subtle misconception. And when I start to think, okay, I'll enjoy in this way and that way and this, then the whole thing is off. Because actually our enjoyment or happiness comes from trying to give happiness to Krishna. Although he's already full, he doesn't need anything from us in any way. But by serving him, we also become happy. It's not that by serving myself I'll become happy. That doesn't work. Just like if the hand tried to serve itself by eating a cake, nothing works out. It shrivels up and dies. But if the hand puts the cake in the stomach, then it's distributed to the hand and all the other limbs. So when we try to serve Krishna, that's where our real happiness is. So these other things, thinking, okay, I'll enjoy this way and that is a will sidetrack a living being. Maharaj, did you have any comments on this?
They say, the impersonalists say that when one becomes liberated, he emerges like a drop of water in the ocean, and he has no more individuality, he doesn't exist anymore. That's similar to the idea that when the green bird flies into a green tree, it appears to merge, but actually if you look closer, you see the bird is still existing, separate from the tree. And the airplane seems to merge into the sky when you're watching the airplane go away, but it doesn't merge into the sky, it just, our eyesight is imperfect. So similarly, the drops of water can be analyzed, and if you're able to break down that drop of water into so many atoms, then you find that the atoms are still sustained, they still exist as individual atoms. So again, it's simply a case of imperfect sense, unable to see how the living entity does still exist, even after so-called merging. That merging is not merging in the sense of giving up all the individuality or all the attributes, but simply we can't see. We cannot perceive how they're different. That's a poor fund of knowledge, and that can be explained nicely. Krishna says right in the Bhagavad-gita, Amaivang so jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana lakshastran indriyan prakriti stani karshati. These are my eternal fragmental parts and parcels. They're always existing and they're struggling in this material nature. So if we accept that Krishna is, God is all powerful, and he doesn't cut the living entities, they're already parts. And because he's full, even though so many parts emanate from him, he remains the complete whole. So in one sense, the living entities are one with him, one in quality, but not one in quantity, because they can fall down, Kshara, but Krishna is Akshara. He never falls down. He never becomes bewildered. He's never overwhelmed by material nature. He's never forced to take birth, or he's never forced to die. He's completely independent. Swarat. Thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj. And this idea of merging into the Supreme Brahman, this idea, this type of liberation is actually very unpalatable to the devotees, because then there's no chance for service. If one just wants to merge into a light, and they're in their spiritual form in some way, shape, or form, but just like the green bird going into the green tree, they're just there hanging out in the tree as a light. So this isn't desirable to the devotees because they want to serve the Supreme Lord in a relationship, and that's not available in this Brahman effulgence. That only one of the three aspects of the living being is realized there, or two, eternality and knowledge. But there's no ananda, because that comes in a relationship. There's no bliss, which is only there from rendering service to Krishna. So this idea of merging isn't wanted by the devotees. And it's also explained just like when there's a child, they are born, they come out of the womb, they grow, and they experience life in the world. And then if they were to say, well, actually, it's very troublesome out here in the world, having all these responsibilities and things, can I just go back to live back in the womb again? It's a very odd proposition. So that's kind of like this merging into wanting to just merge back into the Brahman effulgence. It's not a very wanted or practical position. Are there any other comments or questions? Yes, Magadari Prabhu.
Bhaktin Mercedes was asking if the four defects can be described, four defects of human frailty.
Yeah, the four defects of a conditioned soul are that one, prone to make mistakes. The other one would be a cheating propensity, like if I'm presenting some knowledge, even though I don't actually know about the subject, this cheating propensity is there. 3, tendency to become illusion, and then 4, imperfect senses. So with all of these conditions, how can a living being then make the mistake of thinking they're the supreme person? It just doesn't make sense. If a light goes off in a room, I'm instantly tripping over everything in the room. But then I'm thinking I'm the supreme person who can see the whole creation everywhere. It doesn't actually add up.
If we're all the same soul, then when one person becomes liberated, then we should all be liberated.
It's a really good point. Are there any other comments or questions? Yes, Agadari.
Paritosh Prabhu asks that the Brahmavadis think that they will merge into the Supreme. Is that as arrogant as saying, I am the Supreme?
Well, I wouldn't say it's as arrogant if they're saying that they will merge into the Supreme, because they're accepting that there's something different from them that they're wanting to merge into. But if they're saying that they will become the Supreme, then yeah, there's no substance to this idea. When Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, he was speaking to one of Lord Chaitanya's associates who was his relative, so they could speak a little more loosely and freely. And it's very nice to read, because this associate of Lord Chaitanya, it says all these insults and things to Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. And some of them are pretty funny. But one of the things he was explaining that he's just very dry, like a dry oil cake, because he's just presenting these ideas that have actually no substance to them. There's substance in serving Krishna and hearing about his qualities and his associates and all of these different things. But if one just wants to merge, there's no real substance to this idea. And if another reason it doesn't make sense is if the Supreme Personality of Godhead, everything is emanating from him, so the material energy or the illusory energy Maya is coming from him. It's subordinate to him. So then how would he who's creating this subordinate energy become covered over by it or illusioned by it? It doesn't add up in that way also. Yes, Parameshwar Prabhu.
Nothing to this, then why does Krishna state in the Gita 14:27, Brahmane Pratishtaham, I am the basis of the impersonal Brahman, which is the constitutional position of ultimate happiness.
Well, this Brahman effulgence is there, and people can merge into this Brahman, because all the Vaikuntha planets are surrounded by this Brahman effulgence. It's coming from Krishna. But this idea of one saying that they'll become the supreme person, there's no substance to that. There's nothing actually to it, because God is always God. It's not that Krishna meditates and then becomes God.
So can we actually merge in the impersonal Brahman?
Not merge as in losing individuality and losing like who I am, but merging as in like the example Maharaj gave of a green bird flying into a green tree. So it looks like this living entity is merged, but they're still there. They still have their
So
individuality.
is that an ultimate happiness place?
It's ultimate happiness because it's spiritual. So, spiritual in the sense that one's spiritual eternal principle is not to be under the illusion of thinking I'm this body and to undergo the sufferings of birth and death. So liberated means for them to not have to take birth again. But there's still a chance they may, because they're not getting a higher taste of personal relationship with the Lord. They're not satisfied by simply existing. Even though it's a higher pleasure than the material pleasure that's granted. Because material pleasure is so temporary. And it's so much an illusion. One thinks he's the body. He has to undergo karma. So they're not having to suffer karma, and they're not having to go through death and old age and rebirth. So in that sense, that is the eternal principle of constitutional position of the living entity. He's not aham brahmasmi. But they're missing out on the ecstasy, which is based on personal satisfaction, interaction. So in that sense, it's partial. It's nice to understand the first part. That's the basis.
Is it fair to say that if they don't accept service to Krishna, then they fall back down into the...
Brahma says that, patanchada, yenye ravindaksha, muktamanias playasta bhavada vishuddha buddha, hurya kastrena param param tata, tanchito nadachushvara. They think themselves liberated, but because of Vishuddha Buddha, their intelligence is impure. They can fall down again into the mundane world because they have this desire naturally. They are persons. So they want to have personal relationship, but they don't know anything about spiritual relationships. So they come down to the material plane sometimes and get caught up in altruism and things like that, opening hospitals.
Srimad Bhagavad-gita ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.